The world of hard rock and heavy metal has come out with a resounding support for MICK MARS. 1313 everywhere for the legendary guitarist and founding member of Motley Crue. This is certainly not something that Nikki Sixx, Vince Neil, or Tommy Lee could have ever imagined. After all, Mick was the most quiet of the four. Mick doesn't do press. If anybody would have been the perfect target, the perfect victim for what these three had in mind, it would have been Mick. Mick had to fight. He knew that if he didn't fight, in my opinion, if he didn't fight right now, they would have ruined him. In the sense that somebody that is a quarter part stakeholder who founded the band, who never left the band, who never did a solo project, who in fact had a solo project underway with John Corabi, no less, and had to put a stop to it to honor the contract that the Crue signed that they would never work together. And even though John wasn't a party to that contract, Mick, being the guy that he is, he pulled the plug on that project because he honored that contract, because he thought in his mind that Motley was done. Motley is doing what Kiss is doing. How many farewell tours are there going to be? How many times are you going to well up and cry during Home Sweet Home on stage? So if Mick, who was a part of this band from the very beginning, who funded this band when they didn't have a pot to piss in, who named this band, if he would have been okay with going from 25% to 5%, or if he would have complained and taken the extra 2.5 points that they offered him, if he would have gone from 25% to 5%, complained a little bit, and settled for 7.5%, the same band that signed an agreement saying that they would never tour again, not even write a song again, do you honestly think that their promise of 7.5% or a 5%, 3 months after they said that he would no longer tour but would always be a member of the band, so because 3 months ago they said one thing, now they're saying another thing, how could Mick trust them? I mean, could you trust them? I know I wouldn't trust them. So he had to fight. And he had to file this lawsuit. Not because he's trying to hurt Nikki or Vince or Tommy, but because he wants to see how much the Crue is actually making. Because it's not even that it's 5% or 7.5% of the actual earnings. It's 5 or 7.5% of what they tell him they're making. So he doesn't even know if they're being honest about what they truly make. Whether it's merchandise, downloads, vinyl still sells all around the world. There's still Motley CDs and cassettes floating around from the Motley Records days. I'm not talking about the early 80s. I'm talking about 97 when they left Elektra. They started up Motley Records again. They got the BMG contract, and there are still units all over the world. And they're still making units. Maybe not a lot of cassettes, but they're still making CDs for a limited market, and they're still making vinyl. Vinyl's been, coming back, pretty hard. I'm not saying that it can compare to downloads, but it's still out there. You start adding, these pennies and these dollars all over the place, and they have a distribution deal. They're not with a label anymore. So they're getting a huge chunk of what they sell. And Mick had no choice. I mean, first of all, he doesn't know what the Crue really makes. And from what I understand, I haven't been to Motley.com in a long time, but up until about a couple of weeks ago, MICK MARS was still all over MotleyCrue.com, or Motley.com, I should say. So it's a situation where, honestly, if you didn't fight now, he was going to get screwed. And I hate to put it that way, but he was going to get screwed. And I don't think he wants to be in a situation like Juan Croucier of Rat was in, where, a judge ruled that, he's a quarter owner of the band, but for 20 years they were telling him, no, you're not a member, you're not owed anything. You don't get a cent. And even though Mick was offered this 5% and being pressured to sign a severance agreement. This is the same band that signed the contract, largely publicized all around the world, that they would never tour again. And here they are touring again. They did a stadium tour. And even when Mick told them that he was in agony, in absolute pain, but that he would do the 12 stadium dates, they went ahead and added another 24 on top of that, because they wanted to get every last possible dollar they could into their coffers. And then they wanted to do it again. And that's when Mick said that he was retiring from touring, but not from the band. You know, Mick can still play a mean guitar. He just, you know, and if you read some of the comments and you read some of the articles that have come out since Mick, you know, was essentially forced, because they were trying to force him to sign this severance agreement based off of what Mick has said, the comments are resoundingly positive. They're saying somewhere around 90% of Motley fans side with Mick on varying degrees. Now, obviously, you know, Vince, Tommy, and Nikki are going to have their supporters, but about 90%, and again, you know, these are stats and percentages of comments, and it could be a situation like with Kiss, where you're hardcore Ace Frehley fans, like, you know, curse and bemoan Gene and Paul while they're in the Ace camp or around Ace, but we'll still go to a Kiss concert. You think back to like I think it was like the mid-90s, late 90s, like right before Gene, Ace, Peter, and Paul reunited. There were a couple situations where Ace was doing an expo or something like that, and he was talking all sorts of crap about, you know, Gene and Paul. And I think for one of them, Gene came in with a cake for Ace. And when Gene came in, like half the crowd that was there with Ace, like there for Ace, left Ace and went to talk to Gene. And that same crowd is booing him and heckling him when he wasn't there. But when he arrived, half or more of the crowd went to Gene. Now, Gene was there for Ace with the cake. Doesn't take the fact away that, you know, you can have a guy that likes, or a girl that likes Ace more, but they're still a Kiss fan. And I don't think that people are going to stop going to a Motley show because of what they did to Mick. But I do think that some will. And I do think that public opinion has turned on Motley. And they don't like that. And it's different than Nikki Sixx slamming on poor Carmine Appice, who, by the way, was right. Because I made some videos about Carmine, and I put it in several of the Motley Crue Facebook groups, and I took a lot of abuse from people saying, Carmine doesn't know what he's talking about, Mick quit because he's in agony, Mick will be taken care of, let those guys sort it out, those guys are brothers, when have you ever known Motley to leave anyone behind? And of course I said, well, they kind of left Vince Neil behind in '92. Oh, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, now it comes out that Mick was actually not fired, but kind of shown the way out. And in fact, you know, Stephen Pearcy, of all people, and I say of all people because he's a lead singer, and he's got his woes with his lead guitar player, Warren DeMartini. So, you know, it's a little unexpected for a lead singer to come out in defense of the guitar player, but he came out in defense of the guitar player, and he said they've been trying to get rid of Mick since 1982. I mean, that's like basically the beginning of the band. But they couldn't get rid of him because he funded it and he named the band. But we've heard a lot of people saying, especially Mick, from Mick's own mouth, you know, in that Variety piece, it was published that he believed that not only were they gaslighting him, but he believed that they were trying to get rid of him since as far back as 1987. So whether or not Girls had come out or was about to come out, they were trying to get rid of him. So, I mean, that's way before Dr. Feelgood. That's way before the 94 album. That's way before the reunion and all the albums since 97 or 96. Really 97 because, you know, Corabi was still in the band in 96 and arguably in 97. Corabi was a very big part of Generation Swine. But we've always known that Nikki was very frustrated with Mick during Generation Swine and that he hated that record. But in reality, they've been trying to get rid of him since 87 per Mick. But according to Stephen Pearcy, and if you guys know the history of Motley, you know that Motley and Rat were two peas in the same pod. I mean, they practically lived across the street from each other or a rock star from each other, and they were in each other's videos. And, you know, just recently, Vince and Steven toured. So those guys know a lot about each other. And Steven says they've been trying to get rid of Mick since 1982. So, the fact is, whether he quit or they put him in a situation where he had to quit, it's basically the same thing. He didn't leave the band of his own accord because he thought the band was over when they signed those contracts. And then even when they did the stadium tour, he said, I'll do 12 because that's all you've got right now. They went ahead and added another 24. So in my opinion, a case can be made for them forcing him out of the band. And for them to say, if you don't tour, you don't get paid, or if you don't tour, that's the same as being not in the band. Well, that's not what you said 3 months ago when you had your big media blitz and you said that Mick was always going to be a member and that maybe Mick would write that John 5 was just a touring guitarist. And to me, the other thing about it is you got to figure what kind of a deal did they give to John 5? Did they write a check that like in other words, did they give him an offer they can't back up? Like, did they say, kind of like what Metallica did with oh my gosh, I don't know his name. The guy that replaced Jason. What is his name? I don't know. But anyways, he was in Suicidal Tendencies and played with Ozzy, and I cannot remember his name, and I feel really bad that I can't. I just cannot remember his name right now. I can't remember his name. But anyways, look what they did with him. They said, we're not going to bring you on as a touring member. We're not going to bring you on as a hired gun. We're going to take care. I think they gave him $1 million when he started. Imagine if they do the same thing with John 5. They say, look, we don't want you to feel like, you've just joined the band after 43 years. Not to mention this guy that gave us his blood, sweat, and tears and played in utter agony. We're going to screw him over. No, we don't want you to feel that way. We want to go ahead and make you feel like a real part of the band. We're going to go ahead and give you Mick Sherry. Could you imagine if they said that? And I could imagine it because he is that good of a writer and Nicky likes him that much. And they're already talking about him and Nicky recording. And I say him and Nicky because, Vince can't write a song, not to Nicky's standards. And Tommy can't write a song to Nicky's standards. Nicky is the perfectionist in the band. And I feel like you could even have Geddy Lee up there and he still won't write to his standards because Nicky's standards are only met by Nicky's music and Nicky's lyrics. You know what I mean? But you still have to agree, because it's factual, that Mick Mars had a huge hand, as huge of a hand as you could have in a band with Nikki Sixx, in writing some killer music. And the fact is that unlike Rat, unlike LA Guns, unlike Guns N' Roses, unlike Faster Pussycat, these are all bands, unlike Aerosmith, that have 2 guitar players. Motley has only had 1. And Mick, like Vinnie Vincent, has been able to handle both the lead and the rhythm guitars during parts of the song, and sometimes simultaneously. And he's played the sitar, he's played the mandolin, he's played the slide guitar, he's played the 12-string classic guitar, he's played acoustic guitars. I mean, this is a very, very skilled musician and added an enormous amount of musicianship to the Crue, an enormous amount. Not to mention the fact that if, Mick is correct, Nicky's bass wasn't even plugged in for the last stadium tour. We know that Tommy Lee had some audio track issues because there's a clip of him going to the drums, walking to the drums, and the drums are already heard playing. And Vince has sounded pretty atrocious. So, if Mick can't, get up there and do cartwheels, not that he ever did in the first place, as long as he can play all the notes, that's all that matters. And the fact that Motley got 5 or 6 or 7 of these roadies to give affidavits. Some of the roadies had only been with the Crue for 1 year. To me, is character assassination. Because all the fans that are leaving the most glowing reviews about Mick, especially for this previous stadium tour, have said, look, the guy is not out there jumping up and down. He's not doing cartwheels. He's not rolling around like Nicky with his bass on the girls' tour. But he never missed a chord. He never missed a note. He wasn't out of tune. This is all a bunch of nonsense. And these are people that were front row center. Their ears were bleeding to the Motley Crue sound and loving every second of it. So again, look, I think that right now Motley is probably petrified and they probably don't know what to do. And they're not liking the fact that more and more people are coming out in support of Mick. And they're probably not liking the fact because they thought that nobody would care. Boy, were they wrong.